Hey, everybody, welcome to Red May, your 1 month vacation from capitalism. 43 events, 110 speakers. Wow. You may wonder what's coming up, what we've got left. We've only got about 6 more after today. So let me clue you into some of the things that are coming up. Everything has been great so far, so you probably don't want to miss a thing. At 3 p.m. today, we have What Just Happened, a kind of analysis of the extraordinary events of the last year, including the pandemic, the George Floyd rebellions, and the Was It a Coup? That has Joshua Clover, Jody Dean, Theoria Francos, Idris Robinson, and Nikhil Pal Singh. Tomorrow morning at 10 a.m., Neither Settler Nor Native, with Mahmoud Mandani, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, Samara Esmer, and Ted Swedenberg as the moderator. On Sunday at 11 a.m., Rethinking the Chinese Cultural Revolution with Alessandro Russo, who's the author of a terrific book about it, Andrea Piazzaroli Longobardi, Chris Connery, and Assad Haider. At 5 p.m. on Sunday, Feminist International, How to Change Everything with Veronica Gago, Michael Hart, and Kathy Weeks. These are all, by the way, Pacific time, Seattle time. And on Monday, May 31st at 11 a.m., one of our panelists here, Lee Claire Laberge, is doing Marx for Cats, a radical bestiary with cats, I believe. Actually, live cats, I'm afraid. And on 6 p.m. on Monday, May 31st, Theory of the Gimmick, Aesthetic Judgment, and Capitalist Form. Xiao Nagai's great new book. She's in conversation with Christopher Nealon. So a lot of great stuff. How do we do it? We do it with your support. We have no institutional support. So be generous if you'd like to see this happen again. It's happened 5 times. This is amazingly, this is our 5th anniversary. How this madness continues to keep going year by year is fueled, of course, by volunteer power and contributions. So go to www.redmayseattle.org, and you've got 2 ways to donate: through our GoFundMe, Fan the Flames of Red May, and as a patron. And for Patreon, $3, $5, $10, $20 a month. There's something very 18th century about becoming a patron. My lord, I'm a patron of Red May. So please give according to your will. And enough of that, enough of these crass appeals for the value form, as we commies call it. Let's move on to today's panel, which is about debt. It's called Debt after Graeber, first as a homage to the wonderful David Graeber, who is one of the people we lost and couldn't afford to lose during the pandemic. Some of you are familiar with his book, Debt, and so forth. Others of you in the audience are familiar with the phenomenon of death, I'm sorry to say. It's become ubiquitous since the 80s, and since a couple of financial people discovered the wonderful process of securitization. You slice up the debt into tranches, you form it into a security, you sell it and get it out of the bank store, and you've made money on the fees. You don't even have to worry if anybody can pay. So we've got all these streams of debt that are continuing onward. They're never meant to be paid off. They're part of the extend and pretend, as Yanis Varoufakis called it in Greece. As you would probably also know from following the career of Elizabeth Warren, various bankruptcy laws in America have been enacted over, I think, 3 of them over the last number of years, which ensures that that debt is not dischargeable. So if you are Donald Trump and you screw up your business and you owe all sorts of contractors, you can get out of that really easily through various forms of bankruptcy. But if you're a student on debt, tough luck. That's the situation. We're going to take 5 different perspectives on it today by people who are working around the notion of debt. But a good start would be a political economy perspective. And actually, we happen to have Radhika Desai here from the University of Manitoba, author of Geopolitical Economy and one of our go-to people on political economy. So Radhika, sort of tell us a little about the situation in terms of debt now and what we can look forward in the future after the pandemic. And probably
okay, thanks. Sorry. Thanks, Philip. And thanks, everyone. And thanks, Max, for inviting me and organizing this panel. It's a very topical issue. We talk a great deal about financialization in our time, the fact that we have an economy in which is sort of top heavy with financial activity while productive activity is shrinking. And debt is in fact the opposite, or rather the flip side of the coin of financialization. Financialization occurs because all these big rich people and banks and so on are sitting on an enormous mountain of financial assets. What are these financial assets? For us, they are debt. They are debt that we owe. So if and of course, we are living among an explosion of debt, which is, as I said, the flip side of the explosion of financial activity. And of course, this has also led to an exploding discussion of debt. So I was just thinking today that, since this is named after Graeber, that it might be interesting to point out that the Canadian novelist Margaret Atwood was one of the first to write a popular book about debt way back in 2008. It was her 2008 Massey lectures were called Payback. And of course, David Graeber contributed to this massively, because we talk a great deal about debt because individuals, governments, and businesses are all up to their gills in debt. So how did all this come about? If you think about it, it's very peculiar, because until the 1970s, many people in the West hardly even had bank accounts, let alone had mortgages and whatnot. So I think that, and of course, in our own time today, people talk about financial exclusion. Be careful about accepting that this means something good. It's basically a way of roping more and more people and more incomes of people into the net of debt. This is what they call financial inclusion. So in order to understand this, what I have to say stands at the intersection of many different types of research that I've done. So I've done a lot of writing on international money, particularly the role of the dollar in the international system, which I have argued, unlike a lot of people, relies on the mountain of financialization that we have witnessed since the 1970s. So since the 1970s and the break of the dollar's connection with gold, etc., it has essentially relied on one unstable, volatile financialization and set of asset bubbles after another. The stock market bubble of the 1990s, the housing and crisis bubble of the 2000s being the most prominent. Okay, so and the second thing is I've done a lot of work on Karl Polanyi and his very interesting and I think very correct idea shared by Marx, I would argue, that money is a fictitious commodity. That's a very important thing. And again, thereby hang many, many tales. And finally, my work on Marx as a monetary theorist, which is still largely unpublished, but I'm working on it because I'm just fed up to hear of people saying that Marx thought money was a commodity. It was the opposite. Okay, so I just would like to say that and I'm going to say a lot of nice things about David Graeber in a minute, but I would like to say that I wonder if David Graeber's account in one sense is not politically a bit ambivalent, kind of how to stop worrying and learn to love debt by knowing a cornucopia of historical facts about it. Fascinating though this is, much as it has done to rectify the deficit of understanding about money and debt, it does little to point to a political way out. And my whole presentation is really about what's wrong exactly with the present situation of explosion of debt and what we need to do about it. Now, several points from Graeber are very, very well taken. And obviously, he was a very erudite man, and he wrote an enormous amount that has educated people about debt. Number one, money and debt are closely related. Number two, that most of the money in circulation today is either debt created by states, which is actually now a relatively small amount, which therefore the state owes us money when it issues money, or to private creditors, which accounts for most of the money that is in circulation. And this debt is owed to the creditors. that debt is a reciprocal social and political relation. It is not an economic relation. Money is not a commodity. Credit is not a commodity. It is a social and political relation. So we have to understand that neither money nor credit are commodities. They are not unlike commodities, they are not produced. They are not produced for sale, and they have no costs of production. Therefore, as the entire tradition of political economy realized, even before Marx, but certainly Marx realized this, and people subsequently like Karl Polanyi realized this, that there are special laws that govern the price of these fictitious commodities, just as there are special laws that govern the price of other fictitious commodities, being land and labor. There are others too, but let's just say these were the three that Polanyi identified. So Marx understood this, Polanyi understood this, Ferdinand Tönnies, the guy who wrote Community and Society, understood this. What is not sufficiently understood and discussed, I think, in the literature is that when capitalism comes along, like practically on every other part of the social system, it places very peculiar and contradictory demands on the realm of money. It requires that the operation of money that has been historically established, money pre-existed capitalism, even though it is the soul of capitalism, capitalism did not invent it, it took something that existed and then tried to do something different with it, and very contradictory, because on the one hand it demands one thing and then the result is actually often the opposite. So the capitalism required that money undergo certain changes. Number one, that money become a far better store of value so that capitalists can accumulate it safely without worrying that it's going to lose its value. And the only surefire way that capitalists have so far found of ensuring that money retains its value is to restrict the issue of money. Hence, Ricardo and the Bank Act, which restricted, in 1844, restricted the issue of money, etc., etc. But at the same time, as Keynes recognized, doing this has a deflationary effect. It actually dampens accumulation. I've already well past my first 5 minutes, so I'm just going to be very quick about this. Therefore, capitalism then secondly requires laws that cease to think of credit as a two-way reciprocal relationship and understand it one-sidedly in favor of creditors. And many of you will know Michael Hudson has written a great deal about how the origin of this tendency to look at debt in a one-sided way in favor of creditors racked Rome with routine revolts of debtors, and of course led to tyrannies and whatnot. But since then, we have sort of, medieval times were different, but anyway, capitalism reached over to this Roman legacy and adopted it. Finally, capitalism requires that credit at the same time, while doing all these other two things, facilitate productive accumulation. That, Marx argued, required required capitalists and capitalist societies to take the inherited institutions of money capital, usurers capital, speculative capital, etc., and transform them into something completely different. And we know, particularly through the work of Hilferding, that this happened, but it did not happen in the original homeland of capitalism, where the financial system retained its pre-capitalist characteristics, its speculative predatory characteristics, but it happened in places like Germany and Japan and the United States, where the monetary system was geared explicitly to favor the accumulation of productive capital. But of course, that meant that the monetary system was heavily regulated and so on. So then you get what I in a recent paper I did on Hilferding, I called Hilferding's geopolitical economy of international finance, where the German system and the American system at that time, the Japanese system and many others, were actually the polar opposites of the British system. Okay. So one was aimed to facilitate, what I would call the old plain vanilla banking, which was aimed to facilitate productive investment. And the British system was the opposite. This is also what we have now in the United States, because basically since the 1970s, the US monetary system, which between the 30s and the 70s was among the most heavily regulated, thanks to the banking legislation of the 1930s, was slowly deregulated to become something more like the speculative, predatory, etc. And this I connect with the dollar system, and we can discuss in later on. So to come to my couple of concluding points, and I want to bring us back to Max's very provocative and interesting description of of the thing of our panel. So basically, what I would argue is that the dollar's world role has actually required the transformation of US finance from what it was, which was a relatively good facilitator of productive expansion and so on, into the present system, which is predatory, which strangles productive activity, which of course preys upon workers' incomes and even small business incomes, let's put it that way. And of course, makes states, not only the United States, but countries around the world very indebted, and corporations around the world. So basically, the solution out of this is actually to go back to a conception of debt, which is, which you had, for example, in Germany, and to some extent, even in the Soviet Union and in China today, where credit relations are heavily regulated, and they are geared towards financing production and not towards strangulating it. So, and I've also written recently about the Chinese financial system in a certain way. So to go back to the discussion, the description of the panel, Marx ironically had said that the that the only national wealth that the people own is the public debt, which is to say that they have to pay through their taxes private creditors to pay back their debt. Now, this system, by the way, came into existence when private creditors went to states, like the private creditors in England went to the state of England in the 17th century, late 17th century, and said, if you want money to fight your wars, borrow from us, don't tax us. And this has been the basis of essentially creating vast financial assets for private creditors, and of course, which are paid for by the ability of the states to enforce taxation. If we want to take this back, we would have to essentially demand that the state issue most of the money, that the state then regulate the allocation of money through the credit system in a way that promotes broad prosperity and promotes production, green production, whatever, and that the monetary system not be handed over to a bunch of private creditors to profit from. I think I'll end there. I'm really looking forward to the question and answers and the presentations of my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thanks, Radhika. We're going to shift the order just a bit, and we're going to go to Cassie Thornton, an artist also known as Feminist Economics Department, a wonderful name. But she's the author of The Hologram. Cassie, welcome to Red May.
Thanks so much. We shifted the order just because I just had surgery a couple of days ago and my energy just kind of keeps tanking. So I'm gonna read something that I wrote a little while ago. I'm an artist, so I usually would give a presentation, but I just kind of wanted something to read that was clear while I'm getting better. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you so much for Radhika. Let's see, one second here. So as an artist and as an activist, I've focused on debt as a material for, I think, over a decade now. And after kind of feeling, for the last 5 or 6 years, feeling like I really wanted to stop focusing on debt. Obviously our lives and the world has become more and more encapsulated in debt. And so instead of being able to actually shift away from dealing with debt, I think I decided as an artist to go deeper into it, but to try to create and really kind of find an antidote to debt and indebtedness. And so for the last few years, I've been writing about and thinking about this idea of a sort of a feminist viral peer-to-peer support network, which is now a pretty big project called The Hologram. And the way that it works has a lot to do with undoing a lot of the habits that are created by living in an indebted world, or having many experiences of owing and being taken away from. And so, yeah, I'm going to read a piece that I wrote that kind of came out of some experiments that we were doing within the Hologram project. And then by the end of the piece, after kind of asking a lot of questions and kind of weaving a little bit of a story around the hologram and how health and care relates to debt, it will get to a description about the hologram. So it's all in there. So I'm going to start now. If there is an economy that takes care of people who give care, are there rich people? If there is an economy that takes care of people who give care, does everyone participate in care work? If everyone who gives care receives care, does asking for help make able people feel like a failure? If everyone is equilaterally being supported, do people still feel indebted to those who help them? If our economy centered the production of and care for life, health would be our money. We would not exchange to get it because we would create a culture where everyone had it. The transition would be hard, but not in the way you think. First, we would have to clean up this place, fix the land and water, apologize to the people who we've stolen from, make good with animals and plants. We would have to reorganize all of our physical and social infrastructure that systematically destroys anyone and anything for money. These big industrial green jobs would be easy compared to how much we would need to change about ourselves and about our culture. We would have to change our habits, our values, what we believe makes a good society and a good life. We would have to decelerate our ambition towards individual survival. We would have to stop our attachment to the soiled dreams that allow us to pretend that, as David Graeber said, it's entirely normal that the more obviously one's work benefits others, the less one is likely to be paid for it, or insisting that financial markets are the best way to direct long-term investment, even as they're propelling us to destroy most life on Earth. If there's an economy where caring for others is a standard part of everyone's life, what happens to the personalities and lives of rich white people? If everyone has the time, capacity, tools, and agency to offer others high-quality support, what happens to hierarchical systems and ways of being? If everyone receives support without needing to exchange for it, what becomes of all these supported people? And what do they do if they aren't living a nightmare where bare survival was their full-time job? If there's an economy that centers health and life, how do people value themselves? Most of us are a little sick, and I count wealth as a sickness that spreads as dangerously as COVID, not only because of what it does to everyone who catches it, but more so for those who don't. Also, the human systems it collapses and the violent separation it creates between people. Because of our status as a cooperative species, and because we involuntarily spread all of our most important information, from microbes to viruses to ideas, to everyone around us, one person cannot be healthy when other people are not. What happens when everyone is a little sick, feverish, delusional, stuck in a bad dream? Well, we need more people who give good support, and we can't be picky about who. Everyone is capable of healing and being healed. We on the left say that care should be valued, but what if it was so abundant that it became valued above and beyond money? What if everyone was led to believe that they had the skills and capability to care, and that support work was a highly valuable thing they could do with their time? What if giving support gave the supporter so much energy and meaning that everyone planned the rest of their lives around when they could do it? This is already happening from couches all over the world, hidden in plain sight. I'm a part of a viral feminist peer-to-peer health project called The Hologram. The premise is simple. 3 people, the triangle, meet on a regular basis, digitally or in person, to focus on the physical, mental, and social health of a 4th person called the hologram. The hologram, in turn, teaches these listeners how to give and also to receive care. Over time, each triangle reflects a multifaceted image of the person, a hologram. When they're ready, the hologram will support them to each set up their own triangle, and so the system expands. This peer-to-peer model was first inspired by the free, non-hierarchical integrative model developed by the Group for a Different Medicine at the Social Solidarity Clinic in Thessaloniki, Greece, during the financial and refugee crises. We host courses and workshops and online practice sessions. Many people use the practice in their daily life all over the world. Some of these people meet in a monthly online meeting called the Community of Practice. We are surprised when we ask for support from people in our life and they say yes. We are surprised when the people who give us support in our triangles seem energized by their time giving us their attention and care. We are surprised that we are able to offer care without trying to fix anyone. Many of us are experiencing what it's like to be part of an open, viral care network instead of a closed care circle for the first time. We are feeling what it's like to give care and receive care outside of a framework of exchange. Some of us are trying desperately to let go of our addiction to expertise so we can actually observe and listen. It's hard, but the money's great. So I think it's been really interesting to work on this healthcare project, which is about building long-term social infrastructure that is meant to create like health and stability that exists underneath other forms of healthcare, or maybe instead of forms of healthcare when they're based on predatory financial models. And I know, like, I'm really lucky. I have the surgery that just happened that I really needed. And I live in Canada now, but I'm from the US, and I know how impossible something like this would have been for me if I lived in the US. And so the hologram is really interesting because it is about a kind of long-term planning and for having support when systems crumble under pressures like debt. So even though it might seem a little bit to the side of the conversation, I think it is at the center in some way. Yeah. End of thought. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Yes, I mean, the resurgence of mutual aid during the pandemic and in the future as systems crumble is something that we certainly need to A, promote, and B, talk more about and find new ways to do it. I'm going to go next to Andrew, who's at NYU, has written so many books I can't state them, but I do want to say that he has one particular genre that he practices as a kind of a do-it-yourself anthropologist, where he goes to a bizarre place like Phoenix or Celebration, the town built by Disney, I think in Florida, and certainly in the Gulf Coast, and writes a report from there that are absolutely mesmerizing to me. So Andrew, of course, is a campaigner in the Strike Debt campaign and is an organizer in that. So Andrew, lead us into the discussion of what we can do about debt.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you to Red May. I'm speaking to you from Manhattan, the occupied homelands of the Lenni Lenape people. And I think I'm going to play the role of house historian of activism here and reflect on some of the lessons from the last 10 years of debtor organizing, you know, that began at Occupy Wall Street and with the Occupy Student Debt Campaign and flowed through Strike Debt and to the Debt Collective currently existing. I think if we're going to get to the state of empowerment, which the rubric for this panel points towards, then we need to be focusing on nuts and bolts of organizing, while we're also guided by the knowledge resources that Radhika mapped out. And David Graeber's book about debt inspired a lot of thinking, a lot of scholarship, academic conferences, courses on debt, which is all in good, and I've contributed my own share of that, but it also brought something to the organizing efforts that flowed out of Occupy and are still flowing. And I just want to survey that landscape briefly today. And looking back, I think it's fair to say that the turn towards debtor organizing or debt resistance was a confluence of several factors. One was the existing example of the Jubilee South campaigns of the late 20th century, which were aimed at erasing the external debts of global South countries under the aegis of a jubilee, a single act of mass abolition. And then with the financial crash in 2008, the debt trap of the global south migrated to the north. And some global north countries experienced sovereign debt crises, but also more significantly, perhaps, many households woke up and found that what they believed to be their good debt had turned sour. And that has continued to be the case. Of course, you know, the US and other countries, Canada included, that have fiat currencies, don't necessarily have much of a sovereign debt problem, but we do have problems with municipal debts, institutional debts, and of course, you know, household debts. Some of these debts are legitimate, others are not. And then there are the debts that we owe each other and that feed and nourish our everyday communism, if you like. And this is one of, you know, David's anarchist contributions, I think, to the discussion. The legitimate debts are the socially productive ones. They very clearly benefit communities in very concrete and generative ways. The illegitimate debts are those which are incurred solely for access to social goods like education, healthcare, and housing. These are things that should be properly, adequately, publicly supported and are affordable, and yet are not in most of our societies. So, so we have these two slogans, these two resistance slogans. One is don't owe, won't pay. The other one is can't pay, won't pay. And the difference between these is significant. There's a question of legitimacy with, you know, don't owe, won't pay. And the other one is a question of ability or capacity, as in can't pay, won't pay. And the difference is explained in part by the battle that we've had to wage over the morality of debt. Now, morality is not typically a terrain over which socialists care to do battle, it's fair to say. But in this case, it's absolutely necessary because debt resistance involves breaking down the heavy layers of shame and guilt around the obligation that you always have to pay back your debts. Now, at Occupy, the folks that showed up at Occupy, student debt was, you know, their major challenge facing them. And so the Occupy student debt campaign that we founded at that time was a very ambitious effort to channel that energy in viral ways. The campaign never got close to our goal of recruiting 1 million debt refuseniks. But we learned a lot about debt and finance in the course of trying. We learned a lot about organizing around debt and also about the psychology of debtors. We created some of the, you know, abiding rituals of the movement, you know, like coming out publicly in debtors' assemblies about your debt. And probably most importantly, we raised a lot of public consciousness about the problem. And that consciousness has risen exponentially, I would say, over the course of the last 10 years. The successor group was called Strike Debt, and actually David himself was a little more involved in that one. Strike Debt focused on producing, making concrete products, and two in particular. One was called the Debt Resisters Organizing Manual. The Debt Resisters Operational Manual, and you can still download it from Strike Debt website. And the second one was a staging of the Rolling Jubilee. Both of these projects were aimed at public education. The first one to provide practical financial advice to debtors, and the second one to publicize the workings of the secondary debt market and show how mutual aid can actually be used to abolish debts. Strike Debt also grew chapters all across the country, but like many Occupy groups, it had what I would call its race moment, and it lost its cohesive energy as a result. The successor organization, which we called the Debt Collective, which still exists and goes from strength to strength, was an effort really, again, to return to student debt and to approach organizing from the ground up. unlike the Occupy Student Debt Campaign model, which was very top-down and overly ambitious, we started the Debt Collective with 15 strikers among student debtors from Corinthian College, in the for-profit college system of Corinthian. And the Corinthian 15 strike grew, and it grew into a massive effort to get thousands of federal debts discharged through borrower defense to repayment provisions that we found in the Higher Education Act. There was a kind of loophole in the Higher Education Act, which we opened up and drove a Sherman tank through. And to date, we have claimed to have abolished more than $2 billion from the borrower defense provision, in addition to the $33 million or more from the Rolling Jubilee, which actually is we're currently in the process of reviving the Rolling Jubilee under slightly different auspices, but you'll hear more about that soon. These sums, although they sound substantial, are still drops in the ocean, but what's important about them is that they are what we call proof of concept. Proof that collective action can actually produce results in the field of debt. And this is very important to understand because, for individual debtors, the door is always open for you to go and renegotiate your debts with creditors. They're always willing to talk and renegotiate. And sovereign countries do this also. They go to the club and prostrate themselves before the financial masters at the Club of Paris, and they have their debts renegotiated. But you cannot do it with more than one debtor. That's taboo. That's not allowed. You can't go in there with a group of debtors. You can only go in there individually. And that's why the Debt Collective is set up now as a debtors union. It has dues paying members. We have paid staff. We have more than a dozen chapters in different cities. We're active on a local as well as a national level. We interact a lot with electeds and their staffers, something that would have been, unthinkable in the days of Occupy, when it was, taboo to even speak to someone from an NGO. And we've also had a lot of input on, as a result, on College for All legislation introduced recently by Bernie Sanders and Jamila Prayapal. And we also have a good bit of leverage on Chuck Schumer, who's been pushing the prospect for debt cancellation through executive authority of the President Biden. So if you step back and consider that over the course of that decade, the arguments for debt abolition and for tuition-free college have moved from a very marginal left field position to the very center and mainstream of public opinion. This is something worth reflecting on and something to remember the next time someone tells you that your politics are too far left to be considered worthy of discussion in the real world. This is a good example of how, with some velocity, those ideas have been propelled to the front of public attention. So going forward then, what are the prospects for a debtors union, which we consider to be crucial to, to the landscape of empowerment in a capitalist society right now? Our long-term goal is to have a fully operational debtors union. Well, the theory seems to me quite sound. 21st century capitalism is no longer simply organized around the expropriation of surplus from labor. It's organized increasingly around lifelong revenue extraction from households, generating income streams in 100 different ways to the creditor class. And in the book I wrote a few years ago called Creditocracy, I argued that the point of such a system is not to get not to get us to pay off our debts in a timely manner, but rather to spin out our debt service for as long as possible, to make revolvers of all of us, as most credit card users are, until the day we die, because that's a much more profitable model, and that's what underpins this system of lifelong revenue extraction. So by corollary, these conditions demand a response in the form of collective organization of debtors that will have the leverage to bargain, to refuse, to transform the financial landscape. Debtors unions are not a break with labor unions. I would argue there's very much an extension of the labor movement. Why? Because debts are basically promises of future wages. That's what you do when you sign a loan agreement. You promise your future wages. And I would say that labor unions, of course, are still necessary, but not sufficient anymore. And because they're unilaterally focused on the workplace, and because capital has long since moved out of the workplace and into the social factory, where profit can be extracted from all aspects of our waking life, that's why the debtors union is particularly necessary. Not just necessary, but also, I would say, inevitable. Now, we know that organizing around labor ain't exactly easy, and it gets more difficult every week. But it's so much more difficult, we found, for all sorts of reasons, to organize around debt. And yet the effort must be made. Of course, it's one thing to declare yourself to be a union. I mean, we could do that here and now among the six of us, say we're a union. It's quite another to justify the union's purpose to potential members. So how do we do that? We say we have a track record in abolishing debt, whether through mutual aid or strike action or through pressure on government bodies, through the political contacts that the debt collective has established. One example is everyone knows about this decision facing Joe Biden right now. Sleepy Joe, as Donald Trump used to call him. The decision about whether to use executive authority to cancel student debt. That decision was enabled by Luke Herron, who was a debt collective co-founder. He's now a student at Yale Law School. He wrote the paper that demonstrated exactly how and why the president has that executive authority to cancel debts. Our union also provides a range of services, legal and financial advice, publicity, but above all, a community platform that allows debtors to interact and self-organize and build trust among one another, as workers might do in a common workplace, but as debtors, they're not able to do that because they don't share a network necessarily. So we have to provide them with that network to communicate and build trust. Ultimately, I would say, and lastly, we do need debtors unions because debtor empowerment, like worker empowerment, will lead to transformations in the economy. It will lead to the kind of society where surplus is no longer appropriated by financial or industrial capitalists, and where credit can be properly freed up to be socially productive, as Radhika was describing at the end of her presentation. Credit, after all, is not intrinsically a bad thing. It's often needed, it's always needed in certain circumstances, and it can and should be put to socially beneficial uses. So perhaps I'll conclude in the spirit of Red May by reminding us of long-standing socialist goals regarding the means of production. And maybe I'll end by saying that one of the tasks of 21st century socialists is surely to socialize the means of financial production, if you could put it that way. And public banking is a good start, followed by, credit regulated towards production and away from unearned income, as Radhika described. But what comes next? What comes after that? How does credit become a resource of the commons itself? I think that's a question I'm going to end on because I don't know the answer. So I'm going to end there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. And those are good questions that we can deal with in the Q&A or in the discussion part. I want to go to the organizer of our panel next, Max Haven, who is at Lakehead University and is the author of many books. Some of them are on my shelf, and I can't remember whether it's Art After Money, Money After Art, or Money After Art, Art After Money. But anyway, Max, take it away.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I think the title goes in whichever way. If you're feeling optimism of the intellect or pessimism of the intellect, or optimism of the will or pessimism of the will. Thanks so much, and thanks to Red May and the other panelists. I guess I wanted to start to maybe try and do three things in the short time here. The first is to maybe talk a little bit about how David Graeber inspired me in my work, and then specifically how it inspired some of the questions he was asking inspired me to look at what was the subject of my last book, which was revenge and revenge capitalism. And then I wanted to conclude maybe by posing a couple of questions about the recent enthusiasm for cryptocurrencies, non-fungible tokens, and the GameStop phenomenon, all of which drive me completely up the wall. But I think they're worth us dwelling with simply because of the critical mass of especially young people who have found in them a catalyst for rethinking money, finance, and debt in many unfortunate ways, but perhaps with some openings. So let me begin by saying I didn't know David as well as many people here did. We spoke a number of times. He was a major influence on my thinking when I was a young undergraduate student. Something that I always found very valuable in his work, including the work on debt, was the way that he would sort of, as a trained anthropologist, he would sort of approach these things as if he'd kind of in a way forgotten math. Like he would sort of strip away these questions of the dollars and cents of it and ask, how is power working here? And specifically, I think he would always ask this very interesting question about how power was entangled with the imagination, how imaginary structures are made real, what others have termed, real abstraction in the sort of Marxist frame, but though he had other frames to describe that as well. And then the kind of joyful, playful question he would always ask is, well, if we're doing so much work with the imagination already, why would we choose to do this? Why would we choose to make debt out of the imagination of how we work together and live together? And that was always very inspiring to me. I think some of the things that I've always found vexing but provocative were that even in moments of political ambivalence, David would typically do a thought experiment of trying to take the side of the rebels, even when he didn't necessarily agree with the rebels. The last time I saw him was during the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vest movement in France, which he came out and sort of celebrating not necessarily the movement and its demands and its protagonists, but rather the spirit of grassroots democracy of that movement, in spite of its many problematic aspects. And he would sort of consistently do this, where he would sort of do, as a thought experiment, take the side of those who were in rebellion, maybe coming from his anarchist background. And also coming from the anarchist background, he mentioned a number of times, and I think it'll be the subject, it was the subject of some of his writings, it will be the subject of, I think, the forthcoming book that he's co-authored posthumously, which is trying to encourage us to move our imaginations away from thinking about the problem as one of inequality to thinking about it as one of oppression and exploitation. And specifically, and I'm not sure I necessarily agree with him on this all the time, but he, I think with his sort of broad, sometimes perhaps too broad anthropological gaze, would sort of say, well, the problem with systems of domination is not so much that they produce inequality, because you can have societies that are vastly unequal, where some people have a lot more than others. The problem is domination, when some people get to tell other people what to do. And I'll come back to these themes in a minute when I conclude, but I just want to kind of open with them. I've been studying financialization and debt for a number of years, inspired by many of the folks here in this room and David's work as well. And in recent times, it led me to this question of revenge, because I wanted to link the state of our world being entangled with so many unpayable debts that everyone acknowledges are never going to be paid back. As Andrew was mentioning, this kind of world of revolvers where we're just constantly in the turnstile of paying back with no hope of redemption. I wanted to link that to the particular kinds of political affects that I think the liberal intelligentsia, such as it is, and sort of punditocracy has tried to frame around a politics of resentment or politics of envy for the kind of more far right commentators, but that I've chose to frame as a kind of politics of revenge in our moment that's manifesting most horrifically in the form of, you know, far right revanchist regimes around the world, both that are in control of whole nation states, but that are also insurgent within those nation states and in horrifying ways that I think we can all quite easily identify. And I suppose my effort in the book on revenge was to link the political economy of being under a system that I characterize as revenge capitalism with the kind of revenge politics that breed and simmer and bubble underneath it. And for me, revenge, I mean, is always a risk of adding yet another adjective in front of the word capitalism. Like there aren't, you know, that in and of itself is a kind of weird form of capitalism. Like we're producing more and more ex-capitalism books these days, mostly for the same audience. But I thought it would be interesting to work with it because I wanted to try and understand how something like debt and the machinations of capitalism can go from having a kind of logic to them that, for instance, Marx identified, to these moments of horrendous and violent excess. So, for instance, the way that capitalism produces within it a climate crisis that is not the intention or the desire of almost any capitalist actor, and yet inexorably emerges from the sum of the contradictions of the system itself. Or similarly, I think if you were to talk to most capitalists in their office towers, they would probably say, yeah, it's really regrettable that the world is proliferating in these unpayable debts and people can't get out of them. I mean, neoliberal and thinkers would be the first to say that kind of proliferation of unpayable debts of this sort is going to stymie the ability of people to compete and in market innovation at a certain point. And yet inexorably the contradictions of capitalism as they are means that without the necessity of any kind of conspiracy, certain systemic results ensue. And so that was the starting point for thinking about revenge as emerging here and debt as a kind of symptom or signal or fruit, let's say, of the deeper rhizomatics of this kind of economy of revenge. And of course, I had to take liberties here. Capitalism is not a human being. It is not a subject. It cannot dream of vengeance. It cannot narrate its own existence in terms of vengeance. But as a thought experiment, as someone who works at kind of the intersection of cultural studies and political economy, I wanted to toy with the idea. It required me to do a couple of things, though. I mean, one of them was to think about how, first of all, those who have been oppressed and exploited throughout history, but specifically under capitalism, get targeted for revenge even though they didn't do anything. And here we can think about the kind of horrendous revenge that was enacted on enslaved people and colonized people, even though they didn't do anything to deserve that in the first place. Their mere existence justified the revenge being taken upon them by those who claimed power over them. And second, the way in which then systems of domination and power label those whom they oppress and exploit as pathologically vengeful, such that the enslaved, the colonized, are identified by their colonizers and enslavers as pathologically vengeful subjects who need to be revenged against for their own good or for the good of civilization. And finally, the idea that revenge is something we've been habituated historically, I think, and through the particular cultural politics of capitalism, to imagine that revenge is something that individuals take. And it's this kind of endless human passion. And indeed, an endless human passion that lies coiled in the pit of our souls. And as soon as we attempt some sort of revolutionary change, it's going to spring forth and devour us. And, you know, everything always ends in blood and terror. Rather, I wanted to suggest that, in fact, our whole notion of what revenge is has been shaped by the political economic system under which we live. That is, of course, horrifically individualizing. And instead to say we can equally develop a language to describe revenge as something that systems do, not just something that individuals do. And that revenge is a field of discursive politics. We can argue over the meaning of revenge, not just take it for what it is. So let me conclude by linking this now to this new enthusiasm these days for non-fungible tokens, cryptocurrencies, and the GameStop affair. I'm not going to go into details of them, but for those who are unfamiliar, cryptocurrencies are basically software-backed currencies, allegedly, that allow communities online to sustain their own forms of exchange outside of the command of a central bank through software code. Non-fungible tokens are essentially claims to ownership of digital assets that are guaranteed by a shared ledger or shared document that an entire community signs, essentially, and that is kind of distributed throughout the whole community. So it's not located in one central place. And the GameStop affair occurred when a huge number of small-time investors used basically like apps on their phones, specifically Robinhood, to sort of revenge invest in GameStop, which is a company that sells video games, but of course in the pandemic, it's a brick and mortar store, was doing very poorly. In all of these cases, there are a huge number of young people, millions upon millions, if not tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people from around the world who are investing not only their money, but a great deal of hope in the idea that because these appear at first to be decentralized platforms for ownership, and that they can use them to take revenge on a financial system that oppresses them. Ideologically, to use the technical Marxist term, it's a clusterfuck. I mean, it makes no sense what these people are typically saying in the debates about economic, what's happening. And yet, I think what's important for us maybe to grapple with is that this is the most attention, perhaps since the Occupy movement, maybe even more than the Occupy movement in some ways, that a whole generation of young people are experiencing to contest the fact that they feel deeply alienated, wronged, and estranged from the dominant economic order. Their disposition towards it is an entrepreneurial and mini-capitalist one. And yet I want us to dwell, and I'm trying to think through how to intervene from this perspective that if revenge capitalism gives rise to these affects of revenge, we would be not doing ourselves a favor if we just dismiss them as ideological confusion. And I'm curious to think with you all about how we might intervene in that in ways that don't just revolve around saying like, you should go and read some more Marx, which they definitely should. They should definitely go and read some more Marx. But that kind of like that kind of scolding impetus, which I want to try and push back against and think about how to intervene in this moment of rage that is unfortunately speaking of itself in a language of capitalist entrepreneurship. That's it.
Thanks, Max. Graeber came to Seattle shortly after Occupy was swept from the center of the city. And at one point in his reading, he said, capitalists don't believe anymore that they can make the system work for everyone. So they've stopped putting any effort and all effort in trying to make it so, but are kind of strip mining everything that they can as quickly as possible. Anyway, on that thought, I will go to Lee-Claire Laberge, who is at CUNY and is the author of Scandal and Abstraction and I've got it at Wages After Artwork or Artwork After Ages. I have it on my computer. Makes sense as Artwork After Wages. I'm going to wager. Am I right on the title there?
No, it's Wages Against Artwork.
Huh?
Wages Against Artwork.
Wages Against Artwork. Okay. Here we go.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to Max and to the panelists and everyone at Red May for making this great month possible. My presentation today begins with a question. And although debt is often used to accentuate a so-called intensification of our capitalist present, I think that view is somewhat inaccurate historically. People have been in all forms of debt for all moments of time, and the potential for indebtedness has waxed and waned with changing moments of economic composition and different historical presence. But that said, the question I want to raise today is one of whether we might be preparing for an inclusion of debt from humans into other species. Can we, in other words, have interspecies debt? We know that Christian Marazzi's making of The Indebted Man misses the mark, not just in its titles, retrograde sexism and gender normativity, but now we might add in its species restriction. In Lazzarato's view, everyone is a debtor, accountable to and guilty before capital, and humans inherit not original sin, but debt. A line of thinking obviously traceable to Nietzsche and his famous invocation in the genealogy of morals. So there Nietzsche writes, quote, "To breed an animal that is entitled to make promises, surely that is the essence of the paradoxical task nature has set itself where human beings are concerned. Isn't that the real problem of human beings?" End quote. Nietzsche then traces the promises to conscience, and from conscience, it's a quick path to guilt and finally debt. Quote, "Have genealogists of morality," end quote, Nietzsche asked, quote, "allowed themselves to dream even remotely that the major moral principle, guilt, derives its very origin from the materialistic idea of debt?" And scholars and critics have made much of the German etymology here, where guilt and debt derive from the same lexical wellspring of Schuld and Schulden. But I'd like to shift the focus to another set of relations and oppositions, and that's between human and animal. Nietzsche's use of animal here is meant in perhaps the same sense that Marx also often uses the term. Humans score their infrastructural victories as a civilization by developing away from and distinguishing themselves over and against the non-human animal. That wasn't always the case. Social infrastructures were once more inclusive of non-human animals. From the Middle Ages through early modernity, indeed up until the early 20th century, non-human animals were called before legal bodies to be adjudicated in both religious and civil courts. The scholar J.P. Evans, in his 1906 book, The Criminal Prosecution and Capital Punishment of Animals, provides a compendium of non-human animals in various juridical states. The moles who were excommunicated from the Catholic Church, the pig on trial for matricide. These non-human animals were often provided counsel, and Evan notes that, quote, "one of the most renowned of these animal public defenders was 17th century attorney Bartholomew Chassenet, defender of the rats of Autun, France, who had been accused of destroying the province's barley crop. When the rats did not appear in court after a summons, Chassenet's legal maneuvers included explaining that it was the rats' fear of cats that they would encounter on the way to their journey that kept them from meeting their legal obligation." So end quote. So I want to make 2 points regarding Evans' book and his history of the criminal prosecution of non-human animals. And the first is a rather limited point, and that's in his book, we do not encounter animal trials that have included cases of animals in states of indebtedness. Secondly, I want to make a broader point, and that is that it's, of course, the long trajectory of capitalist relationality that removes non-human animals from their station as juridical subjects. The various desacralizations of capitalism entail a reduction of subjects and objects to their ability to circulate as exchange value. Nature becomes, well, first it becomes nature, a site of potential excavation. Non-human animals play a curious role here. Before the rise of capitalism, and I'm particularly thinking about Northern American indigenous communities, European Middle Ages, animals were members of a shared social world and certainly a shared economic world. Capitalism transforms this condition, however. And of course, one of its central mechanisms for doing so is that of the wage. One separation that the wage entails is the separation between the human animal and the non-human animal. And it is, of course, the wage which sets the historical scene for indebtedness under capitalism. So if you will, let's now position ourselves in medias res of capitalism and of liberal conceptions of jurisprudence, where today a new field of animal law has begun to agitate for the legal recognition of animal personhood and other forms of status. Including animals in the pantheon of liberal subjects has its own limitations, and I'll just mention two. First, following the legal historian Makisha Deka, she has pointed out that we don't really need more liberal juridical subjects because that subjectivity is always used in the service of some form of hierarchy. And then secondly, the attorney George Druckler offers a different argument. He wonders if animals are protected through a scheme of rights, must they also be punished for their wrongs? And then he asked the somewhat awkward question, are we ready to envision prisons for animals? I read these debates as setting the historical scene for the emergence of forms of animal indebtedness. First, and this is somewhat tangential, in the US and much of the capitalist global north, animals can function as a debt and they can be seized in a debt-related asset forfeiture. This includes both pets and working animals and industrial animals. But secondly, any animal placed in, let's say, a boarding facility or a vet's office actually becomes an asset that underwrites its own care, right? So if you run up a $500 bill at a vet's office and don't pick up or don't pay the bill, your animal is now seen as being worth $500, and the vet or owner of whatever facility has the right to try to use that animal to somehow redeem that money. Still, being materialized as a debt and being subject to a debt seem like different levels. But I really have started to wonder, and this is truly a speculative question, at what point will animals become subjects of debt? That question is becoming a little bit less speculative with the worrisome endeavors of a group calling itself the Interspecies Internet. And this is a coalition of artificial intelligence people and neuroscientists who have backing from Google and MIT, among others. Just as guilt and debt share a history, so do specie, a precious metal, and species, a taxonomical kind. One of the initiatives that the Interspecies Internet partnerships support is a, quote, interspecies currency transfer app called Linnaeus. It hardly matters that this appears to be the reactionary work of a group of corporate profiteers, just as it hardly matters that it appears to be the first entreaty into forms of interspecies payment. Rather, we should see Linnaeus as the idea of a class and a vision of class-based economic expansion. Linnaeus as a platform seeks to interrupt and counterpose sentiments like this one from a federal judge who in 2017 rejected a lawsuit filed on behalf of Naruto, a monkey who took a highly circulated selfie image of himself. All sorts of newspapers ran this image, and then the monkey sued in US federal court for copyright holdings of the selfie that he took. The judge ruled, quote, there's no way for Naruto to acquire or hold money. There is no loss to reputation. There is not even any allegation that the copyright could have somehow benefited Naruto. What financial benefits apply to him? There is nothing, end quote. And now this is how Linnaeus, the interspecies money transfer app, describes its own organization on its white paper, which is available on its website. Linnaeus writes, quote, it is obvious that non-human species are unseen by the market economy because no money has ever been assigned by them. In order to preserve the survival of some species, it is necessary in some situations, usually when they are in direct competition with humans, to give them an economic advantage. They should hold money, end quote. This follows such ambivalent entities as the self-owning forest in Germany called Terra Zero, as well as forms of suggested limited self-equity that non-human animals would be able to hold in themselves. But if we know anything, it's that capitalist inclusion always presumes capitalist exclusion. And Radhika, of course, made this point in her paper. To be a subject of the wage is always and necessarily to be available to its opposite, the debt. And it's a quick transition and a historically well-documented one to go from holder of money to holder of debt. So I just want to end with the question, will non-human animals begin to be included in this specifically capitalist scene of indebtedness? And if so, who and how will organize against this, and for whom? Okay, thank you.
Wow. Let's bracket that new version of the ownership society for a moment and come back to that. Thank you very much for all your presentations. And I have a large number of sort of questions or areas which I'm fascinated to hear what you have to say about. So let me start with the notion of streams, which has come up. Everybody has noticed or mentioned that whether it's the sudden appearance of small fees in banks in the 70s or 80s, that all these laws that were lifted, so those things can be charged, or the interest rate limit in states has been removed so that national banks could charge whatever they want. We've seen a dependence, a seeming dependence of capital on a large number of different streams. We would also put rent streams in that too, for example, where you used to be able to buy software like CS5 or Adobe, but now it's been put on a rental basis. So even though you have spent $300 or $500 to have it, they're not upgrading it anymore. So you're forced to go into the rent model, which is coming back. So all these streams are coming out into capitalism. They obviously seem, from our point of view, very unnecessary. The world could just as well do without these streams, but to what extent is capital so committed to the continuance of these streams that the resistance to canceling or cutting back on debt streams, fees, rent streams is going to be so enormous that the whole thing, the feeling is that the whole thing might collapse should these be taken away. I mean, I really don't know to what extent capital accumulation at the moment is dependent upon the existence of these streams, as opposed to the more traditional notion of extracting surplus value in production. So I wanted to get everybody's impression as to what they think. How crucial is this to capital in its current incarnation? And how much really can be shaved off of it without pushing capital to its final bow?
Maybe I can jump in, Philip, and I think is a good question. And I think what you're describing is tantamount to actually what Michael Hudson described as a toll booth society, or a toll booth economy, where every single asset, every single social good can be converted into an asset from which you can then generate these income streams in the form of fees or fines. I think you have to add this sort of element of punishment, in deference to Max there, an element of punishment there. So we're really talking about fines and fees. And then the question you raised towards the end, how sustainable is this for that form of capitalism, is an important one, because if we accept, again, as Max said, that all of these, the ability to make those income streams is finite, and they're essentially unpayable, our debts are unpayable, then what's in it for capital in general? And you mentioned that, when David came to Seattle, he said, capitalism has given up trying to legitimize itself. It's strip mining all the way, right? Which I think is an important observation. But I think the answer to that, and has always been the answer to that, is that where the state steps in. The state's job as a handmaiden of capital is to step in and harmonize and restore equilibrium and to make sure that the system works not just for capital in the individual pockets or sectors of capital, but for capital in general. And the state is constantly doing that in a number of ways. And in a very blunt sense, the state makes sure that for most households, they're able to stay afloat, even though the objective conditions would determine that they're not able to. But if you look at the household as a basic unit, and this is something, and we discussed a lot in strike debt because we've been focusing on student debt before then. And we realized that to focus on a single debt class is very artificial because that's not how debt functions. The Federal Reserve does it very well with its statistics. It will, produce these silo statistics for each form of household debt, but that's not the way how households experience debt. There are many debts that flow through households, and they're all interdependent. And an unforeseen medical bill knocks a household sideways, or you're unable to keep the automobile on the road because of some subprime loan that was taken out. So the whole thing goes haywire, and you have a state of disequilibrium, and then people have to decide what to prioritize. Which forms of debt service should they prioritize? And if you live in the US, it's going to be the automobile. Actually, it's auto debt service, because you can't function in the US without a car in most parts of the country. So that's the state's job. And so I do agree, in retrospect with that observation about capitalism having given up. It's not clear to me that capitalism ever did a very good job of legitimizing its system. But the strip mining continues, and it is the job of our electeds to make sure that the system continues to be sustained, and that the strip mining doesn't exhaust and drain us and suck us dry. You're on mute, Philip.
If we can pursue that a little in terms of the US political system, the Democrats seem to want to fulfill the role of collective capitalists, which is to make it work. The Republicans have for a long time been trying to dismantle the state. You have essentially their capitalist base. There are people who are the recipients of a great deal of government largesse without acknowledging it. All the industries that have been subsidized in the Southwest and the West, but somehow have never acknowledged the subsidies that they've got, and think of the people who run them, think that their success is due entirely to their entrepreneurial skill, and if the government would get out of the way or whatever. Whatever it is that drives them, their at least nominal role has been trying to dismantle the government. So I guess, jump in on this, Radhika, and tell me what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to first go back to the original question and just put in a couple of cents worth of mine. So I would say that, first of all, it's wrong to think that capitalism was always a pure, a system of accumulation through production, because there was always a rentier element to it. That was what colonialism was about. The colonial countries extracted capital from the rest of the world. And even in the United States, without formal colonies, the United States had a variety of means, including financial means, of extracting, from the rest of the world. And that's how you got the word gunboat diplomacy, because when the states to whom they lent, or the corporations to whom they lent, couldn't pay, then the Americans showed up. The official bailiffs of the American states showed up in order to guarantee payment. So I think that's one part of it. Secondly, yes, there is definitely a sense in which, certainly compared to the type of capitalism we had in the 50s and 60s and the 70s, there is something new today, and there is definitely a huge element of a rentier character. And there I would say that it seems as one way of looking at it, and I'm sure there are many, but one way of looking at it would be to say that basically Western capitalists no longer wish to produce in a context where ordinary manual workers get anything other than the absolute lowest incomes. And that's why all the jobs where manufacturing jobs, where ordinary manual workers were getting better than the least good types of jobs and so on, they have been farmed out. So that what we have now here in American society, for example, is a tiny elite layer of highly skilled workers who are well paid, and they also sort of merge into the capitalist class in the upper echelons of that. And then, so they are sort of part of the 10%. And then the rest of the people who can, who get service sector jobs, no benefits, low wages, and sometimes even, no guaranteed hours and so on and so forth. And this has been, so that's partly, and on the one, so that's one thing. Secondly, I agree with Andrew that until very recently, it's been the case that certainly in Western capitalist countries, the states have tried to keep demand up by sort of keeping people barely afloat, etc. But now I'm not sure that's even the case, because you look at American labor force participation rates, they have declined a great deal. So people are kind of opting out of this whole system. So I mean, they have to. There is no way that they're not being kept afloat, basically. So just a couple of set of thoughts on your original question.
I maybe just want to follow up on that quickly, and then actually turn it into a kind of question to follow up for Leclerc as well on this, which is, so it strikes me that the answer, like this question about the assetization and financialization of capitalism, wherein what is most profitable for capitalists is to monopolize an asset or a revenue stream and transform it into a constant stream of revenue that can then be further securitized, and you can sell tranches of access to the revenue stream from the asset. I mean, yeah, that seems to be the height of capitalist abstraction. But I guess the question of if it will lead to a crisis beyond the kind of contingencies of sort of geopolitics comes down to a question which I know other panels have addressed with much more specificity this month, but about like what is value, and fundamentally, is there, like, do we agree with Marx that there is a fundamental difference between capitalist profit and capital's value and valorization system? And I mean, I think the wonderful thing that Marx continues to give us is this idea that underneath whatever's happening on the surface of the capitalist planet, underneath there's a tectonic that builds and builds as assetization, financialization, and debts accumulate, while underneath there's actually not a significant or at least correlatory change in the actual production of like goods and services that keep people alive and that fulfill needs. And so eventually there's going to be a reckoning, unless that reckoning is like displaced and displaced and displaced. And to my mind, it makes me think, again, it comes back to these questions of like where we locate our struggles too. And it, yeah, there's been a kind of reaction to I think debt organizing from people who are more interested in a kind of older workerist form of struggle that says, well, we should be focusing on not the site of profit, basically how the ill-begotten gains of capitalism are going to be distributed, but on the place where value is produced, which, for many sort of old-fashioned thinkers is like the factory. I don't agree with that. I think it's actually really interesting to dwell with the places where people are feeling the pain of capital as the place to enter into it. But what I wanted to tie this maybe to Leclerc's presentation is, I'm wondering in furtherance to your question to us about like, will animals be debtors essentially, or will we be in debt to animals as well, is like, do animals produce value under capitalism, or are they basically there to hold the tender human heart at ransom? Like, you were mentioning like the vet bill, and in that transaction, is it that the animal is going to produce a value that contributes to the commonwealth that then gets extracted and divvied up in unequal ways by capital? Or is it more that the animal and the animal's like sort of legal characteristic as a debtor or a creditor is kind of a way of reckoning with the human capacity to create value? Because I sense that in a kind of more orthodox Marxist interpretation, it would be the animal cannot produce value. It's only the human that produces value using the animal. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to put in the chat, and maybe we can share this on the stream, just a link to the Linnaeus platform. No, I think it's an interesting question. I mean, I think that definitely in any sort of orthodox sense, it's not only that animals can't produce value, but they can't labor, right? I mean, I think they can work, but they do not engage in abstract labor. That said, I think this particular vision for animals, non-human animals, it's not yet one of debt. It's one of precisely the kind of service-based expansion of, you know, streams and fees that will be held by animals who themselves are uniquely identifiable through facial recognition software. And, you know, people and apps will take a cut when the money comes and goes, right? And then a particular population of, say, orangutans might have accumulated enough money to be able to buy its own forest out of being developed, right? But it's a service, I mean, it's a fee-based transfer system. So I think in that sense, and in both the sense of the, you know, Marxist question of what is included in the labor theory of value, but also in the sense of understanding financialization and, you know, the capturing of sort of rent streams. I don't think either of those is so difficult to address, to answer. But as you yourself pointed out, Max, I mean, you know, the law of capital is also a law of unintended consequences. And there is a necessary need for the creation of new populations to index these forms of assets, securities, wages, so on and so forth. At the same time, there's always a need to retract those once they have been issued and indexed. And yeah, I just, after reading this and seeing this group, this interspecies internet group, I mean, that clearly is the vision, to engage in the sort of like wilds, if you will, of biomass in the project of indexing certain streams of rentier capitalism, which I do think it's interesting.
Can I just jump in here? I mean, this is really quite interesting, and Philip is writing these very interesting questions in the chat, like, are animals? So first of all, I just want to say that when I think of animals, I think we have to think more about the millions, billions of animals that we farm, rather than the pet that we take to the vet, etc. And there, what humanity is saying, what capitalist humanity is saying to these animals is, you owe us your lives. We have already, you know, as part of the sort of practical rhetorical stance that Marx was describing about revenge and owing and other things, etc. We are kind of, the way we treat animals, we are saying that they owe us their lives, so that we can raise them and keep them and slaughter them as we will, right? So that's kind of, and so that's, and in that sense, of course, they are nothing better than constant capital. And the way to think about it actually is not so much to compare animals to workers, rather they are more in the status of slaves. Slaves do not produce surplus value, although they produce surplus product. Because you don't pay slaves, you buy them, you employ them, you have to feed them, of course, if you want them to work, otherwise they will die, etc. So I think that that's how we are treating animals. And then I just wanted to say also that couple of other things. I mean, I think that the kind of scenario, Leclerc, that you were painting, which is fascinating, and I really made me think. I think there's also a similarity with debt bondage. You know, where essentially people enslave themselves in order to redeem their debt, on the principle that they own themselves and therefore they could give themselves away. Now, of course, legislation against slavery in the homelands of capitalism, particularly in the UK, then took a certain form where you could not sell yourself. That was prohibited. That's how slavery is prohibited. You cannot legally sell yourself. But of course, other people could be sold, and they were bought and sold, not just until 1812 or whatever it was, but well into the 19th century and continuing even today in the 20th century in third world countries. So I think that's what we have to take account of. And I mean, there are many other points, but one other thing I wanted to throw into this is, Andrew, your point, about the prohibition of negotiation with collectives of debtors, it actually reminded me of Adam Smith. He makes a very sarcastic statement somewhere that all these employers who you put a couple of them in a room and they immediately start conspiring, and then they should complain about trade unions being conspiracies of workers. So the employers are acting as collectivities all the time, but they want to prohibit employees from talking about collectivities. And right now, all this rhetoric about China being a rogue debtor, etc., comes out precisely because China's behavior as a creditor is so different that it's not going to sit and conspire with Western creditors in the same way. So the Westerners are so used to sitting in their Paris club and whatnot and negotiating debt with third world countries individually, picking them off, etc. They don't really want to, that's part of their complaint about China. Anyway, I thought I would just mention those couple of things. And so, sorry, that also really made me realize the importance of what you said, Andrew. Labor unions are necessary, but they are no longer sufficient because debt has become another way of essentially extracting value out of workers.
Yeah. Can I just ask Lee Claire, because she's opened up this debate, and I'm thinking of even the wider consequences, the debate about the rights of nature. I mean, beyond non-human animals, because where and why would you make that distinction and draw that line of demarcation? But when people argue about rights, of course, they often forget that the rights and responsibilities come together, and rights entail responsibilities and obligations. And then once that opens up, that domain of responsibility, then the possibilities of talking about what is owed and who owes becomes very instrumental. If you can stop capitalist extraction of natural elements in the whole spectrum of natural assets and resources, then why not go further and talk about what is owed to sectors of the environment that have been exploited for so many years, not just animals. I hesitate to say Pandora's box, because we use cliches like that. But as you well know, it does extend the domain of discussion. And I wonder why you draw the line with non-human animals here.
Sure. Thanks for that. I mean, I did make reference to a project called Terra Zero, which is a self-financing forest in Germany. And I'll put that link in the chat in one sec when I finish answering your question. The reason I did that, Andrew, is because there is a history in the jurisprudence that both predates and postdates capitalism that tries to answer the question specifically of non-human animals, almost entirely mammals, not entirely mammals, but almost entirely mammals. And I think that there are aesthetic and sentimental dimensions to that organization and the organization of the logic. The reason that I stopped with it today is because I've been thinking about this question for a while and working on it for some of my Marx for Cats work and thinking about relationships between Marxism and animal studies. But then I located this past week these new technologies and these sort of groups of corporate profiteers, universities. I mean, you all know the sort of coalition of partners that one can imagine. And they have specifically indexed and sort of delimited certain forms of animals with whom to undertake this experiment, which seems to me like a very well-trod path of, first you pay and then you ask for it back, right? first you give the wage. I don't know if this is a wage properly speaking. I think it's not, but it has wage-like characteristics, right? But first you include in a sort of pantheon of capitalist services and logics. And then once you are included, it's a predatory inclusion, right? To use that term. And then you can extract back from that in perhaps different ways. I genuinely don't think we know yet. Yeah, I wouldn't use the term Pandora's box either. I'm glad you decided not to do that.
Yeah, I think of that phrase, Marx's phrase, to be a productive worker is a misfortune, and there's something about to be included in the economy is a misfortune. I'm thinking mostly of Hernando de Soto and those plans to take squatters in Peru and give them money so that they have bank accounts and ownership of property. Yet, of course, the notion is once you're in, you don't own, but you're owned by the ownership society. And all those laws too, that union pension funds have to have half of the members of their board have to be bankers, and the investments all have to be made according to the highest best use or something, which is directing them into the most volatile areas of the economy and making them dependent, in that wonderful Alan Greenspan way of people who own houses or have debts don't become socialists. So, we see where that goes. I had another question. We've been talking about debt and personal debt, but we haven't even broached the idea of corporate debt at the moment, which is enormous. I'm told at the moment that the way to raise money, as opposed to the time-honored way in economic textbooks where they tell you where a corporation goes to the stock market and does an initial offering, and then people who think this is a good company and want to invest in it for 5 years, provide a lot of money, gets funding. They're going to short-term money markets, which are all less than a year, but often only a day, overnight markets. So you have repos, commercial paper, and so forth. And corporations are paying their operating expenses through this, which absolutely blows my mind. They're paying salaries and things off of this constant turnover in short-term money markets, obviously because they want to remain as liquid as possible, and they seem to have no belief in long-term investments. What do you make of this particular activity?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to come in on that very briefly. I would say that's, while of course what you are saying is true, the bigger set of reasons why corporations have been borrowing so much money has to do with the fact that they use this borrowed money for share buybacks. Because interest rates are so low, you bring in this money, then you buy back your shares, which means that your share price goes up. And because CEOs are paid not on the basis of how well they are running the company, how much they are producing, how well they are treating their workers or customers or anything, or the environment, they are paid according to what the value of the share is. So you can imagine the mind-boggling conflicts of interest involved in this, where the same people who will benefit from this, they will borrow the money, so they are indebting the company, and then they are buying it. And I think the low interest rates are also another really interesting things, because right now a lot of individuals will also say, for example, in locally here, the Canadian stock market, which has never had the Canadian housing market, which has never had its 2008 moment. The house prices are rising and rising and rising, and the Bank of Canada is loath to increase interest rates, because the moment it does so, it's going to prick the bubble, which has been inflating now for a long time, much longer than the US. So the point I'm trying to make is that individual borrowers are borrowing. They say, oh, money is so cheap, let's buy a house. But all these people, as soon as interest rates start going up, they will be is sitting on unmanageable debt. Plus, like in the US housing market before, a regime of low interest rates tends to actually compromise the interests of buyers of houses, because at low interest, people are willing to pay more. And typically what happens is at the bottom end of the market, where there are entry level people, first-time house, small houses, they are the ones that are the most overpriced, you see, because that's where all the people who are trying to use this anyway. And so it's like a tout, you know, these low interest rates are like a tout. They ensnare you in the web of debt. And then once interest rates go up, you've had it, essentially. Or you are already paying very high interest rates in order to buy peace of mind so that you don't have to pay high interest rates. But at the speculation level, what's also happening is, by the way, that people are essentially as margins thin, you know, when in order to, if the profit you'll make from a trade is 0.00001%, the more money you can borrow to throw into this trade, the bigger the profit you'll make in absolute terms. So amount of leverage trading that's going on is enormous, and that's the only thing that's benefiting. So only asset markets are benefiting from low interest rates. They are not benefiting productive investment. This is the key. The Federal Reserve keeps saying, oh, we want to encourage employment and so on. That's why we are keeping interest rates low. It's bullshit. It's complete bullshit. That's
Then we have to make this absolute distinction between the use of debt, between the individual who is taking the low interest loan, which will morph at some time in the future into some sort of adjustable rate burden, and the opportunities for speculation at the high level, where one can get all this cheap money and throw it into into real estate or whatever, the asset economy that Martin Cohn
stocks, bonds, you name it, right? And so the thing is, in order to return, so interest rates should be low. The only low interest rates can benefit production. But in order to ensure that they actually go to production, you have to regulate the financial sector so that it is not open to speculation. And what happened in America was the Glass-Steagall Act was repealed. It essentially prevented ordinary banks from speculating. Today, they are free to speculate. For the last 20 years, they have been free to speculate, right? And that was the last major deregulatory move. Sorry, I should stop, but yeah.
Well, does anybody have a kind of a final statement on the prospects of the indebted? What was, as Lee pointed out, was called in an unfortunate way the indebted man, but let's talk about the indebted without any kind of attribution. Where is debt taking us? Where is it taking capitalism? And what can we expect in the future after the pandemic, as some of these debts that have accumulated start to perhaps come due?
I mean, I guess I have two, I think, fairly banal observations. I mean, one of them is just that I think as the debt bubble grows and grows and grows, the mechanisms by which capital seeks to displace it will become more and more violent, unfortunately. I think, like somebody needs to provide value to make up for all of that profit. Like somehow that gap needs to be closed. And I think, David Harvey's and other people's work have shown us that, going back to Rosa Luxemburg and Marx, that is often a violent process that can end in war, colonialism, empires. So I'm quite concerned about that. The second thing I guess I'm curious about, and I've wondered about it for the last 10 years of debt organizing, is I think I'm quite convinced that as a Achilles heel of capitalism, at least in Turtle Island, North America, and Europe, debt can be quite a compelling target. I'm curious what if it provides enough of a sense of a heroic or rebellious we to those who are debt resistors. In my limited organizing around debt, I've always had trouble in the sense that people can sense a shared form of pain from being indebted especially for things they shouldn't have been indebted for, like having a place to live, having the means of transportation, getting an education, getting medical care. And yet, does debt provide enough of a kind of common platform for a shared narrative, for it not only to resolve itself into particular policy recommendations, but also a kind of revolutionary constituency? Like, will debtors inherit the earth? And can they speak of themselves that way? And what would it mean to create such a narrative? It's an open, honest question.
So how does one turn individual pain into collective pain? Good point.
And how does one go from being a subject in pain to being a subject who deserves the world?
Fair
Well,
enough.
I think only after we abolish capitalism. Because, I mean, I just wanted to say that simply on the question of debt, I think one thing we have not really discussed is also the financialization of our pensions. And that's another huge time bomb that's ticking. Already many pension funds in America are simply unable to pay. So workers' incomes has evaporated. The second thing is that I think we need to, I think what Andrew is doing in terms of the debt strike and so on, I think those are very important things, and I agree with him. And finally, I'd say, I think what we need to do is we need to demand incomes, not debt. I mean, this is the whole issue where our incomes have been replaced by debt, and we have been inveigled into thinking that somehow we are being offered this privilege of getting credit. No, you are getting the privilege of getting indebted, and so on. And when in fact you should be getting a proper income for your work. And I think, and my point about capitalism was not a joke. I mean, why do housing markets experience bubbles? Because there's not enough social housing. We need to more and more, people need to essentially get together to produce what we need. We need houses, let's build houses. We need hospitals, let's build hospitals. We need schools, let's build schools. We need buses, let's build buses. That's, there are many things that are total no-brainers. Sure, I don't want to be told by some planner whether I shall wear a polka dotted frock this summer or a striped frock this summer, but those things are minuscule compared to the really big decisions, which can be totally socialized, where people get things because it's their right to get them. Like in socialized medical systems, people get healthcare. Why should not education, housing, and all sorts of basic needs be provided for? Then you worry about all the discretionary things and let free markets do what they want and so on. But anyway, you get my point.
Lee, do you have a final thought here?
No, I mean, I just think that I think in a sense it follows from Max and Radhika's point, but that all of our shared sort of Marxism needs to be a continually evolving project, I think, is how I would just stress that. And then I would thank everybody also, because I learned so much from all of you, not just today, but all the time.
Thank you also. And we also say goodbye to Andrew, who had to rush off to get on a ferry, whether it's to Staten Island or one of the bizarre paradises he chronicles in his book. Who knows? I'll leave that as a mystery. Thanks everybody for
Thank you.
considering this ongoing discussion. Really, it's one discussion for the whole month with different interventions. And I'll see some of you at 3 o'clock for what just happened for the last year. And to the rest of you, I wish a wonderful day. Oh, please go to www.redmayseattle.org and click on donate and give us some money so we could keep doing this badness. And enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Philip. Thanks, Max. Bye-bye. Thanks,
Thank you.
Mahin.